I will send a report to the county court if necessary. I will let a real judge deal with him. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. She was threatening to involve a real judge while talking to the son of the county's most respected judge, though, of course, she had no idea about my family connection. I sat there in complete shock, not because of the threat itself, but because of how perfectly she had set up her own downfall without realizing it. The woman who was demanding that a real judge handle our case had no idea that she was about to get exactly what she was asking for, just not in the way she expected. When we got home that evening, I discovered something that made the whole situation even more disturbing. Our mailbox had been tampered with. Inside was an envelope with no return address, containing a handwritten note that read, "Advice from a neighbor. Be careful. She's watching families 24/7." The fact that someone felt the need to warn us anonymously told me everything I needed to know about the climate of fear that Patty had created in our neighborhood. As I stood there reading that note, I looked up toward Patty's house and saw a camera flash from her second-story window. She wasn't just making threats, she was actively stalking us, documenting our every move like some kind of private investigator building a case. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with an overzealous president. We were dealing with someone who had completely lost touch with the boundaries of normal human behavior. The next morning brought a whole new level of crazy that I honestly hadn't thought was possible. I walked outside to get the newspaper and immediately noticed a small surveillance camera mounted on the utility pole aimed directly at our yard. When I looked up at it, I heard the unmistakable click of a camera shutter from Patty's second-story window. She wasn't even trying to hide her surveillance operation anymore. She was flaunting it like some kind of badge of honor. But the real shock came when I opened our mailbox and found an unmarked envelope containing what appeared to be an official-looking note. HOA advisory. This family requires special monitoring. The casual way she had turned stalking into what she presented as legitimate HOA business was both terrifying and absurd. It was like watching someone slowly lose their grip on reality while maintaining absolute confidence in their authority. That's when Deputy Carson showed up for the first time, and I got my first real glimpse into how Patty had managed to turn our local law enforcement into her personal enforcement army. Carson wasn't a bad guy, he was just a cop trying to do his job based on the information he'd been given. Unfortunately, the information he'd been given came entirely from Patricia Williams, which meant it bore about as much resemblance to reality as her property value charts. Carson approached my barbecue grill like it was a biological weapon. "Do you have registration for this under Regulation 23C?" he asked with complete seriousness. It sounded like he was talking about an intercontinental ballistic missile instead of a backyard cooking device. When Kate came outside carrying a basket of fresh flowers from her garden and offered Carson some lavender, saying it was very calming. His response was to look at her with genuine suspicion and ask, "Ma'am, is this a controlled substance?" The idea that my wife was potentially dealing drugs through her flower shop was so ridiculous that I almost started laughing. But Carson's expression told me he was completely serious. That's when I realized that Patty had managed to create an entire alternate reality, where normal activities like grilling hamburgers and growing flowers were treated as potential criminal enterprises. She had fed Carson and probably other local officials such a steady diet of manufactured crises that they were approaching our family like we were some kind of domestic terrorist cell operating out of suburbia. But I wasn't. Completely helpless. My years as a teacher had taught me to document everything when dealing with unreasonable people. So I had started recording our conversations on my phone. What I discovered was that Carson was essentially operating based on email requests from the HOA, rather than any actual legal violations. He was just doing what he thought was his job, but his job had been defined by Patricia Williams rather than actual law enforcement protocols. That's when Mrs. Jones appeared with a stack of papers that changed everything. "Gavin," she said, "I have email chains that prove Patty has been changing HOA rules without any community votes." She had been quietly documenting Patty's abuses for months, collecting evidence that showed a pattern of manufactured authority and systematic harassment. The third escalation came when Patty decided that having someone help us was unacceptable. Patty posted no visitor signs like we were in a biological quarantine zone and hired security guards to enforce it, turning our house into a sealed military base under lockdown. The absurdity of needing armed security to protect a suburban neighborhood from people visiting their own families would have been comedy gold if it weren't happening to us. The security guard was this poor guy who was just trying to earn a paycheck, but he had been told that our house was some kind of security risk when my father showed up for what should have been a normal family visit. The guard actually stopped him and said, "Sir, no visitors are permitted." Being the patient man he is, calmly explained, "I'm just here to visit my son." But the guard, following his instructions to the letter, replied, "I'm sorry, sir. Rules are rules." That conversation became the moment when everything changed. Though none of us realized it at the time, my father, Judge William Morrison, one of the most respected jurists in Orange County, stood there being told he couldn't visit his own son by a security guard who was following orders from a woman who had appointed herself as the supreme authority of our neighborhood. The irony was perfect. Patty had just picked a fight with the one person in the county who actually had the legal authority to shut down her entire operation. When I called Dad that evening to apologize for the embarrassment, his response was calm but carried an undertone that I recognized from my childhood, the voice he used when someone had pushed things too far. "Son," he said, "I need you to tell me exactly what's been happening. I need every detail." For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt like we might actually have a way to fight back. The chapter ended with Patty's biggest mistake yet. She called Deputy Carson, and not realizing that I had started recording everything, left a message that I captured on my phone. "I need you at the meeting tomorrow." There might be a need for strong intervention. She wasn't just harassing us anymore. She was planning to escalate to the point where she'd need police back up to handle a family barbecue. What she didn't know was that her strong intervention was about to meet the real definition of legal authority. Dad didn't just investigate. Patricia Williams. He conducted the kind of thorough background check that only someone with 25 years of judicial experience knows how to do. What he discovered was a pattern that went way beyond simple HOA overreach Patty had systematically driven for other families out of Maple Ridge using identical tactics: manufactured violations, escalating fines, surveillance, and intimidation. Campaigns that made normal family life impossible. The most disturbing part was how organized her operation had become. Dad found records showing that she had unilaterally changed HOA bylaws without community votes, created entirely fictional regulations that she presented as official rules, and had been using HOA funds to pay for her personal legal expenses and bonuses for board members who supported her power grabs. She had essentially turned our neighborhood association into her personal dictatorship, complete with financial corruption and systematic abuse of anyone who questioned her authority. We spent an evening in my garage, spreading out a map of Maple Ridge and marking houses with red pen. The map was covered with red marks, for families had been turned into victims of the same copy-paste harassment script. Too many cars in the driveway, lawn maintenance issues, children's noise violations, unauthorized decorative elements. She had transformed each family into casualties of her manufactured authority using reasons that sounded official but were completely fabricated. Looking at that map, those red marks scattered across our neighborhood like battle casualties, made me realize that we weren't dealing with an overzealous volunteer. We were dealing with someone who had turned harassment into a systematic campaign of community destruction. Each of those red marks represented a family that had been forced to abandon their home because one person had decided they didn't belong in her neighborhood. These weren't violations. They were scare tactics. They had worked. It wasn't just the homes marked on the map that had been affected. It was the entire neighborhood that had been living under an invisible fog of fear and obedience, waiting for the next accusation. The fourth escalation came when Patty discovered that I had hired a lawyer, though, of course. She had no idea that the lawyer was my father, one of the most powerful judges in the county. Her response was to double down on the visitor restrictions, installing not just signs, but actual security patrols. and threatening legal action against anyone who came to our house without her explicit permission. She was essentially trying to place our family under house arrest in our own neighborhood. The security situation reached peak absurdity when Dad showed up for what should have been a normal Sunday dinner. The guard approached him with this apologetic but firm demeanor and said, "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification and verify your visit with the HOA." Dad, maintaining the kind of patience that comes from decades of dealing with courtroom drama, replied calmly, "I'm here to have dinner with my son's family." But the guard, following Patty's increasingly paranoid instructions, insisted, "I understand, sir, but I have to follow protocols." What Patty didn't realize was that every interaction, every escalation, every abuse of power was being documented by someone who understood exactly how to build a legal case. Dad wasn't just collecting evidence. He was preparing for the kind of comprehensive legal response that would shut down her operation permanently. He had discovered that her behavior wasn't just annoying or inappropriate, it was actually illegal under several state and federal laws governing harassment, stalking, and civil rights violations. The breakthrough moment came when I suggested recording the next HOA meeting. "Dad," said, "I think we should document the next meeting so people can see what's really happening." His response was immediate and decisive. "Excellent idea. Transparency is the foundation of justice." But what I didn't know was that Dad had already been planning something much more dramatic than simple documentation. That's when he told me about Patty's biggest legal vulnerability, her systematic violation of proper HOA procedures. She had been operating under rules that she had created herself. Without community input or legal authority, everything she had done to our family and the other victims was based on fictional regulations that had no legal standing whatsoever. She had essentially been running an elaborate confidence game, using people's assumption that HOA rules were legitimate to justify behavior that was actually criminal harassment. The chapter reached its climax when Addie made her next fatal mistake. She called Deputy Carson and scheduled what she described as an emergency meeting to vote for our permanent banishment from the neighborhood. She had prepared what she called legal documents to formalize our expulsion, and she wanted police backup in case we caused trouble during the proceedings. What she was planning was essentially a kangaroo court, with herself as judge, jury, and executioner. But she made one crucial error in that phone call. She said, "I need you there tomorrow for strong intervention," not realizing that I had started recording all communications related to our situation. When Dad heard that recording, his expression changed in a way that I recognized from childhood. The look he got when someone had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "will be the last day she serves as HOA president." He was no longer just investigating Patricia Williams. He was preparing to end her reign of terror once and for all. The morning of Patty's emergency meeting started with what I can only describe as the most adorable act of rebellion in suburban history. Sophie had been quietly observing everything that was happening to our family, and she decided to express her feelings through art. She created this amazing drawing of Patricia Williams as a classic fairy tale witch, complete with a pointed hat, an evil grin, and a broomstick, and she hung it on her front door like a tiny declaration of war. Kate found it first and started laughing despite everything we were going through. "Honey," she called to Sophie, "maybe we shouldn't hang this where everyone can see it." But Sophie, with the absolute conviction that only 8-year-olds can muster, replied, "But Mom, she really is mean to Daddy." Sometimes children see the truth more clearly than adults, who get caught up in trying to be diplomatic about people who don't deserve diplomacy. But Patty's final assault was already in motion. And it was bigger than anything she had attempted before. She had spent the previous week building what she believed was an airtight case for our permanent removal from the neighborhood. Fake emails, fabricated witness statements, even photos of broken flower pots. Patty had constructed an entire crime novel with our house cast as the villain. The woman who couldn't stand the sight of our lavender, it somehow managed to make Us looked like a suburban crime syndicate operating out of a garden center when Deputy Carson showed up with what he described as an investigation warrant. I realized that Patty had managed to convince local law enforcement that we were actually dangerous. Carson wasn't being malicious. He genuinely believed he was responding to a legitimate threat. Based on the mountain of fabricated evidence that Patty had provided, the whole situation had escalated from annoying HOA disputes to potential criminal charges. Based entirely on one woman's ability to manufacture reality, that's when Kate showed exactly why I married her. As Carson prepared to escort me away for questioning, she stepped directly between us and said with absolute clarity, "Officer Carson, no one is taking my husband anywhere for grilling hamburgers and growing lavender. Show me the real evidence." Her voice carried the kind of authority that comes from knowing absolutely that you're in the right, and for the first time, Carson hesitated. In that moment, looking at her shielding me with nothing but her voice and conviction, I remembered why I had fallen in love with her in the first place. Kate didn't just believe in flowers and community. She believed in standing firm when it mattered. And now she was doing it not with protest signs, but with love and spine. Carson might have had a badge, but Kate had something better: moral clarity. It disarmed him more effectively than any argument I could have made. Sophie's reaction broke my heart and made me proud at the same time. She wrapped her arms around my leg and declared, "Daddy didn't do anything wrong." The kind of fierce loyalty that kids show when they see their parents being threatened. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about HOA rules or neighborhood politics anymore. This was about whether we were going to let one person's need for control destroy our family's sense of safety and belonging in our own home. That's when Mrs. Jones emerged as our unlikely hero. She didn't just bring video evidence. She brought printed email chains, recorded phone conversations, and documented proof of everything Patty had been doing for months. Her evidence showed that Patty had been systematically modifying HOA rules without community votes, destroying permit applications from other residents, and even recording private conversations where she admitted to planning the destruction of families who didn't submit to her authority. The most damning piece of evidence was security camera footage that Mrs. Jones had been collecting for weeks. It showed Maddie sneaking into the yards of 3 other families to plant fake violations, placing unauthorized decorations that she could then discover and use. As justification for fines and harassment, she had been literally framing her neighbors for violations that she herself had created, then using those fake violations to justify escalating persecution campaigns. But the moment that changed everything was when Carson actually looked at the evidence Mrs. Jones provided. You could see the realization dawning on his face that he had been manipulated into participating in a systematic harassment campaign. He radioed dispatch and said, "Cancel that warrant. We have a situation here that needs different handling." For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like someone in authority was actually seeing the truth of what was happening to us. That's when I made the call that I should have made weeks earlier. "Dad," I said, "I can't handle this by myself anymore." His response was immediate and reassuring. "Son, you don't need to handle it by yourself. I'm on my way." Dad was already in motion, having left the courthouse still wearing his judicial robes, bringing with him the full authority of his office and 25 years of experience dealing with people who thought they were above the law. The chapter ended with perfect dramatic timing, just as Patty was declaring victory to the small crowd that had gathered. To watch our removal, Dad's car pulled up to our house. He stepped out wearing his full judicial robes, carrying his official briefcase, and looking every inch the federal authority that Patty had been pretending to represent. The expression on her face when she saw him was worth every moment of harassment. We had endured pure shock mixed with the dawning realization that she might have finally picked a fight with someone who actually had the power T. We gathered to determine the fate of a family that has consistently disrupted the peaceful harmony of our community. The way she banged that gavel and gestured with her fake authority would have been hilarious if she weren't trying to destroy our lives. "Mr. Gavin Morrison," she continued, "you stand accused of willful violations of community standards, aggressive behavior toward residents, and general disregard for the welfare of your neighbors. But then something happened that Patricia Williams had clearly not anticipated in any of her elaborate planning. The door opened. My father walked in, wearing his actual judicial robes, carrying his official court briefcase, and radiating the kind of quiet authority that comes from 25 years of presiding over real legal proceedings. The entire room fell silent in a way that was almost physical. You could literally feel the energy change as everyone realized that actual legal authority had just entered Patty's pretend courtroom. Dad surveyed the scene with the kind of calm assessment that judges use when they're trying to understand what exactly is happening in their courtroom. I heard there was a trial taking place here, he said in that measured tone that all experienced judges develop, but I don't see any actual legal authority present. The contrast between his genuine judicial presence and Patty's costume party version of legal proceedings was so stark that it made her entire operation look like a child playing dress-up. Patty's response was everything I had hoped it would be and more. She started stammering, clearly trying to process what was happening. Who are you? The woman who had been so confident in her authority just moments before was suddenly face to face with someone who actually possessed the legal power she had been pretending to wield. Judge William Morrison, Orange County Superior Court. Dad replied with the kind of calm precision that courtroom professionals use when establishing their credentials. And the man you're attempting to put on trial here is my son. You could have heard a pin drop in that room, the neighbors who had been sitting in Patty's fake jury box suddenly looked like they wanted to disappear into their chairs. But Patty, to her credit, or detriment, or depending on how you look at it, wasn't ready to give up her fantasy just yet. That's impossible, she declared. Gavin can't have a father who's a judge. The desperation in her voice was almost painful to hear. This was a woman whose entire sense of power and control was crumbling in real time. She was clinging to denial like a life preserver. Dad's response was perfect. You're absolutely right about one thing, Patricia. This isn't a real trial. But since you seem so interested in legal proceedings, let me show you what actual judicial authority looks like. He opened his briefcase and began removing official court documents, evidence folders, and legal papers that represented weeks of proper investigation and documentation. The moment when Dad demanded to see Patty's official HOA bylaws was when her entire house of cards finally collapsed. She handed over her rulebook with shaking hands, and Dad immediately identified the sections where she had taped additional rules onto the original page's modifications that had never been voted on by the community and had no legal standing whatsoever. These changes were never approved by the residents, he observed. You've been enforcing non-existent regulations and using them to harass innocent families. A murmur rippled through the room as neighbors leaned forward, reading the marked-up pages Dad held. You could see the realization hitting them. All the tickets, fines, and fear they'd endured were based on lies taped into a binder. One man whispered, "She fined me $500 for a rule that doesn't even exist." A younger woman gasped. She told me it was state law. The illusion of authority Patty had spent years crafting was disintegrating in real time, replaced by a collective anger that had been waiting far too long to surface. Watching Patricia Williams' confident facade crumble was like watching a building demolition in slow motion. Her hands started shaking. Her voice began quavering. For the first time since I'd met her, she seemed to realize that she wasn't the most powerful person in the room. I was just protecting property values, she whispered, as if saying it quietly would somehow make it more reasonable. Dad's response was delivered with the kind of judicial authority that ends arguments permanently. What you were doing, Patricia, was systematically harassing your neighbors, falsifying official documents, and violating multiple state and federal laws regarding civil rights and personal liberty. Your actions constitute criminal behavior under several statutes, and they end today. The chapter concluded with Deputy Carson stepping forward to address Dad directly. Judge Morrison. He said, I owe you and your family an apology. I was acting on information that I now realize was completely fabricated. Carson's willingness to admit his mistake and realign with actual legal authority marked the moment when Patty's web of manipulation finally broke apart completely. But Dad wasn't finished yet. He picked up the nameplate that read, HOA President from Patty's fake bench, and placed it in front of me. There will be new leadership in this community, he announced. But first, we need to address the issue of ensuring that no family ever faces this kind of harassment again. The look on Patty's face told me that she was beginning to understand that her reign of terror wasn't just ending. It was about to be replaced by actual consequences for everything she had done. The restraining order that Dad issued wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a masterpiece of legal precision that effectively ended Patricia Williams' ability to terrorize anyone in our neighborhood ever again. The 500-yard restriction meant that Patty couldn't come within that distance of any Maple Ridge resident, which, given the layout of our neighborhood, essentially banned her from her own home. The irony was absolutely perfect. The woman who had tried to control everyone else's access to their own property was now legally prohibited from accessing hers. Watching Patty discover the practical implications of the restraining order provided some of the most satisfying moments of this entire ordeal. Her usual 2-minute drive home now required a 15-minute detour through back roads and side streets to avoid violating the court order. I happened to be outside one morning when she drove by on one of these elaborate routes, and the expression on her face, pure frustration mixed with disbelief that her own tactics were being used against her, was worth every moment of harassment we had endured. The for sale sign appeared in front of Patty's house within 48 hours of the restraining order being issued. She didn't have any choice in the matter. She literally couldn't live in her own home without violating a court order, and Judge Morrison had made it clear that any violations would result in immediate arrest and criminal charges. The woman who had driven 4 other families out of the neighborhood was now packing her own belongings under the watchful eyes of the same neighbors.
Nice.
She had spent months terrorizing. The moving truck situation provided the final touch of perfect irony that this story deserved. Patty's moving truck blocked the street for an entire afternoon, a clear violation of the very traffic regulations she had used to harass other families. But instead of calling the HOA to complain, everyone just quietly went about their business. Because we all wanted her gone more than we wanted to enforce the petty rules she had created. The symbolism was beautiful. Her departure violated her own regulations, but nobody cared, because the regulations themselves had been the real problem all along. As word spread about Patty's departure, neighbors began emerging from there. Houses like people stepping out after a long storm had finally passed. Mrs. Cindy from 2 houses down approached me with tears in her eyes and said, "For the first time in 3 years, I can play music in my garden without being afraid." An elderly gentleman named Frank, who lived on the corner, told me, "I planted a memorial rosebush for my late wife, but Patty made me remove it. This weekend, I'm putting it back where it belongs." These weren't just stories about flowers and music. They were stories about people reclaiming their right to feel at home in their own neighborhood. My inauguration as the new HOA president was everything that Patty's fake trial had pretended to be, a genuine community gathering focused on actual problem-solving rather than power games. Kate stood beside me with a bouquet of flowers from our expanded garden, which now included not just lavender and roses, but also the unauthorized plants that several other families had started growing in solidarity with our situation. The message was clear. We were moving from a neighborhood controlled by fear to a community based on mutual respect and common sense. With the support and encouragement from our neighbors, Kate decided to expand her flower business right from our home. She created a small corner in our front yard where people could stop by to purchase flowers, herbs, and plants, naming it the Reclaimed Garden, in honor of everyone who had won back their freedom to make their homes truly their own. The little hand-painted sign she made became a symbol of everything our neighborhood had fought for and achieved together. The common sense code that Kate and I developed to replace Patty's manufactured regulations was intentionally simple and focused on actual community welfare rather than control mechanisms. Rule 1. Be kind to your neighbors. Rule 2. Respect personal property. Rule 3. Community cooperation over individual control. Rule 4. Barbecue grills appeared in yards throughout the neighborhood as families realized they no longer had to fear HOA enforcement for simple pleasures like cooking outside. Kids played freely again on sidewalks and lawns. riding bikes and drawing. Chalk art that once would have earned their parents a warning letter, the sense of fear that had hovered. Like a cloud over Maple Ridge was lifting, neighbors began waving at each other again. Chatting during morning walks, even organizing a block party, the first in years, that block party became a landmark event. We had music, homemade food, games for the kids, and even a small plant swap hosted by Kate and Sophie. One neighbor brought homemade peach cobbler, another manned the grill, and the kids set up a lemonade stand that donated proceeds to a local shelter. What had once been a community divided by fear and micromanagement was now rediscovering connection, joy, and shared purpose. Mrs. Jones, the quiet powerhouse who had provided the evidence that turned everything around, was honored during the block party. We presented her with a hand-painted neighborhood guardian sign and a bouquet of wildflowers that Kate and Sophie had put together. She cried, and for the first time in years, they were happy tears. Later, that night, Kate and I sat on our front porch, the smell of lavender drifting through the warm air. Sophie curled up between us, tired but smiling. "I like it better this way," she said simply. "Me too," Kate whispered. Squeezing my hand, I couldn't have agreed more. What started as a war over lavender had turned into a fight for the soul of our neighborhood, and we had won. Not with anger or revenge, but with truth, courage, and an unshakable belief in community. Even Deputy Carson, who had once approached our home with suspicion and a warrant, became a regular presence in the neighborhood, not to enforce, but to connect. He stopped by during the block party, off-duty and in jeans, and brought homemade chili. People who had once been afraid to speak up were now openly talking about ideas, sharing opinions, and working together on new initiatives. One group started a neighborhood watch, not for tattling or surveillance, but for looking out for one another's safety. Another family began organizing monthly potlucks. Kate's reclaimed garden became a symbol of rebirth and resilience. People from nearby neighborhoods even came to visit. Inspired by what had happened in Maple Ridge, we shared our new community code freely, encouraging others to prioritize respect and cooperation over control. The local news eventually picked up the story, running a feature titled "From Harassment to Harmony: How One Family Sparked a Neighborhood's Renewal." They interviewed Dad, Kate, and even Sophie, who proudly showed off her artwork of Witchy Patty and explained, "In the blunt honesty only kids can deliver, she was mean, but we beat her with flowers." That line went viral, and while we didn't want attention, we realized that telling our story could help others in similar situations. Emails and letters poured in from across the country, families who had endured bullying from HOAs, couples who had faced retaliation for planting gardens, and elderly residents who were threatened with fines for wind, chimes, or porch chairs. We responded to every one. Kate even started an online support group called Homeowners for Harmony, where people could share stories, get advice, and learn how to fight back legally against overreaching HOA. As Dad contributed pro bono, legal templates and guides. Mrs. Jones moderated the forums, and I told our story unfiltered, honest and raw, because people needed to know that they weren't alone, and that even the most oppressive situations could be overcome with the right mix of documentation, courage, and community. 1 year after Patty's departure, Maple Ridge looked and felt like a completely different place. The HOA meetings were now actual community discussions. We held them outdoors, under string lights, with coffee and cookies instead of judgment and fear. Residents spoke freely. Problems were solved with empathy, not enforcement. And instead of ending with threats of citations, meetings ended with hugs, laughter, and new ideas. Sophie helped create a little neighborhood, lending library. Kate taught gardening workshops from our yard. Frank planted an entire memorial garden for his wife. Neighbors helped maintain it. The man who once received a $500 fine for his mailbox color now had a rainbow-painted one, and no one cared, in fact. They complimented it. And perhaps the most poetic justice of all was what became of Patty's former house. After sitting empty for a few months, it was sold to a young couple, artists, who immediately painted the door lavender. They added wind chimes, a peace flag, and a little ceramic fairy house under the maple tree. Kate baked them a pie on their first weekend, and Sophie drew them a welcome sign. They joined the community with warmth and smiles and no fear. We didn't erase what had happened. We honored it. In the new community center, we created a small wall display titled The Turning Point. It included a framed copy of the first fake violation notice we received, a copy of the restraining order Sophie's withdrawing, and photos from the first block party. At the bottom, in bold letters, we wrote, "May we never forget how far we've come and how hard we fought to get here." People who visit often pause in front of it, and many add notes, stories, flowers. It's a living testament to what we endured and what we reclaimed. This isn't just a story about a bad HOA president. It's a story about standing up. You're scared about defending your family's right to live in peace, about not letting petty tyranny steal your joy. It's about lavender, yes, but it's also about love, because in the end, it wasn't legal documents or restraining orders that transformed Maple Ridge. It was love, fierce, defiant, and unwavering. Love for family, for community, for fairness, and for freedom, and that kind of love. That's something no HOA can regulate, no matter how many rules they tape into their binders. Barbecue grills appeared in yards throughout the neighborhood as families realized they no longer had to fear. HOA enforcement for simple pleasures like cooking outside. Kids played freely again on sidewalks and lawns, riding bikes and drawing. Chalk art that once would have earned their parents a warning letter. The sense of fear that had hovered like a cloud over Maple Ridge was lifting. Neighbors began waving at each other again, chatting during morning walks, even organizing a block party, the first in years. That block party became a landmark event. We had music, homemade food, games for the kids, and even a small plant swap hosted by Kate and Sophie. One neighbor brought homemade peach cobbler, another manned the grill. The kids set up a lemonade stand that donated proceeds to a local shelter. What had once been a community divided by fear and micromanagement was now rediscovering connection, joy, and shared purpose. Mrs. Jones, the quiet powerhouse who had provided the evidence that turned everything around, was honored during the block party. We presented her with a hand-painted neighborhood guardian sign and a bouquet of wildflowers that Kate and Sophie had put together. She cried, and for the first time in years, they were happy tears. Later, that night, Kate and I sat on our front porch, the smell of lavender drifting through the warm air. Sophie curled up between us, tired but smiling. "I like it better this way," she said simply. "Me too," Kate whispered, squeezing my hand. I couldn't have agreed more. What started as a war over lavender had turned into a fight for the soul of our neighborhood, and we had one, not with anger or revenge, but with truth, courage, and an unshakable belief in community. Even Deputy Carson, who had once approached our home with suspicion and a warrant, became a regular presence in the neighborhood, not to enforce, but to connect. He stopped by during the block party, off-duty and in jeans, and brought homemade chili. People who had once been afraid to speak up were now openly talking about ideas, sharing opinions, and working together on new initiatives. One group started a neighborhood watch, not for tattling or surveillance, but for looking out for one another's safety. Another family began organizing monthly potlucks. Kate's reclaimed garden became a symbol of rebirth and resilience. People from nearby neighborhoods even came to visit. Inspired by what had happened in Maple Ridge, we shared our new community code freely, encouraging others to prioritize respect and cooperation over control. The local news eventually picked up the story, running a feature titled "From Harassment to Harmony: How One Family Sparked a Neighborhood's Renewal." They interviewed Dad, Kate, and even Sophie, who proudly showed off her artwork of Witchy Patty and explained, "In the blunt honesty only kids can deliver, she was mean, but we beat her with flowers." That line went viral, and while we didn't want attention, we realized that telling our story could help others in similar situations. Emails and letters poured in from across the country, families who had endured bullying from HOAs, couples who had faced retaliation for planting gardens, and elderly residents who were threatened with fines for wind chimes or porch chairs. We responded to every one. Kate even started an online support group called Homeowners for Harmony, where people could share stories, get advice, and learn how to fight back legally against overreaching HOA, as Dad contributed pro bono legal templates and guides. Mrs. Jones moderated the forums, and I told our story unfiltered, honest and raw, because people needed to know that they weren't alone, and that even the most oppressive situations could be overcome with the right mix of documentation, courage, and community. 1 year after Patty's departure, Maple Ridge looked and felt like a completely different place. The HOA meetings were now actual community discussions. We held them outdoors, under string lights, with coffee and cookies instead of judgment and fear. Residents spoke freely. Problems were solved with empathy, not enforcement. And instead of ending with threats of citations, meetings ended with hugs, laughter, and new ideas. Sophie helped create a little neighborhood, lending library. Kate taught gardening workshops from our yard. Frank planted an entire memorial garden for his wife. Our neighbors helped maintain it. The man who once received a $500 fine for his mailbox color now had a rainbow-painted one, and no one cared, in fact. They complimented it. And perhaps the most poetic justice of all was what became of Patty's former house. After sitting empty for a few months, it was sold to a young couple artists who immediately painted the door lavender. They added wind chimes, a peace flag, and a little ceramic fairy house under the maple tree. Kate baked them a pie on their first weekend, and Sophie drew them a welcome sign. They joined the community with warmth and smiles and no fear. We didn't erase what had happened, we honored it. In the new community center, we created a small wall display titled The Turning Point. It included a framed copy of the first fake violation notice we received, a copy of the restraining order, Sophie's witch drawing, and photos from the first block party at the bottom, in bold letters. We wrote, "May we never forget how far we've come, and how hard we fought to get here." People who visit often pause in front of it, and many add notes, stories, flowers. It's a living testament to what we endured and what we reclaimed. This isn't just a story about a bad HOA president. It's a story about standing up when you're scared, about defending your family's right to live in peace, about not letting petty tyranny steal your joy. It's about lavender, yes, but it's also about love. Because in the end, it wasn't legal documents or restraining orders that transformed Maple Ridge. It was love, fierce, defiant, and unwavering. Love for family, for community, for fairness, and for freedom. And that kind of love, that's something no HOA can regulate, no matter how many rules they tape into their binders.